Mexico, and I figured eventually we would exit that era and have again a governor that was going to be willing to act on climate change. And I mean, honestly, I did not foresee a president like President Trump. So I thought, here's a year's worth of work. It'll be relevant. And then as I was kind of pulling it all together and working on it, we saw 2016 happen. And we did eventually get a governor who cares about climate change. But the Trump administration changed so much about the trajectory that the US was on in terms of climate change that I really needed to think about what the larger message needed to be and how to share that with the public, and also kind of change my own trajectory too. I was planning on leaving journalism, and I thought, I did this project on climate change, I'll turn it into a book. Everybody will have information and some tools, and I can go and not have to be a journalist anymore. But that didn't happen.
Oh boy. Well, how did you pull it off? Because I know you're a working mom, and it's pretty tough to produce a book while you're working full time to earn a living. So what was that like?
Yeah, it was a lot of nights and weekends for a long time, kind of working on it in between everything else. And then in the summer of 2019, I had the opportunity to be at Mi Casita in Tres Piedras through the Leopold Writing Program. And I thought I was just going to I had rewritten the book a couple of times at that point, and I thought I'll just kind of smooth it all out and wrap it up. And with the luxury of that month to only focus on hiking and writing, I rewrote the book again, and finally felt like it was the right thing. So that I certainly appreciated the time to not be, filing daily stories or things like that.
Well, that's pretty great. And I'll add that you're the second person I've talked to in the last month who finished a book at Mi Casita in TP. So that's developing into a pretty wonderful little institution. But
Yes.
here's another thing that I wanted to ask you, and that is that as you spent all this time, these several years, developing the book and really thinking about New Mexico's climate challenges, is there anything in particular that stands out that surprised you? One of the reasons I ask that is that you weren't a newcomer to the subject matter, and certainly not to New Mexico. I've been reading your journalism rooted in New Mexico for years and years and years. You really know this state inside and out. And I'm just wondering, was there something you came across that took you by surprise in the course of producing Precipice?
Yeah, I think the thing that takes me by surprise, and this isn't to say that there aren't lots of amazing people working on these issues in New Mexico, but I think the thing that took me by surprise most of all is I've really spent a lot of my career, and a big chunk of the book is about the Rio Grande and the fact that it does dry every year, almost every year now. And I think the thing that surprises me is that we still haven't come to terms with what that means and found innovative solutions to prevent that from happening and to really tighten up our agricultural water use, which I know is a touchy subject and also a really big complication. But I think part of me, as I have covered this story for years and years and years, I'm always surprised, why hasn't someone fixed this by now? Where are the solutions? I think that's the main thing, which is a little bit discouraging.
In reading your book, I was reminded that though we've known what we needed to do for decades and decades, New Mexico is really still just as far behind in terms of adjudication of rights, in terms of maintaining a database of of wells and withdrawals and all that kind of stuff. We're as, we seem to be as much in the dark ages as we were, I don't know, back in the 90s and the 80s when I first started studying water in New Mexico. Can you disabuse me of that idea and reassure me that things are better than that?
No, I think that we're moving in some good directions. Like for instance, the Water Data Act that was passed a couple of years ago, and the movement on and having systems that communicate with one another in terms of collecting and aggregating water data. But the adjudication issue not only is a big beast all of its own, it's also oftentimes, I think, an excuse to not make some serious changes, because the excuse is we haven't even adjudicated our water rights yet. How can we talk about some of these longer term solutions and different ideas? I think we kind of get hung up on that. And I certainly don't have the solutions. I try to talk to people who do, but it is astonishing to think that we've known about climate change for a very long time, and the US government has known about it since the 1960s. Um, and yet we have made so very little progress.
I'm sure over the years, and not just doing the book, but covering the Martinez administration. And by the way, I thought that was one of the most valuable parts of the book for me, was to see what the Martinez administration did. I mean, the dismantling of basic environmental protections and the reversal of everything that was positive that was being done toward climate change is right at the same level as the Trump administration. I mean, just as bad. And so looking at that stuff, I keep wondering what the motivation of people like that could be. You know, partly it's greed, partly it's ideology. But somehow when I add up those two things and think about, you know, the threats to their own children and their own grandchildren's environment, it doesn't quite work. Can you shine some light on that? What, is there something more?
That's such a good question. I think about that all the time. I think for the Martinez administration, there was a basic um, like disdain for kind of the larger public and the larger public good, and certainly for government service and public service. But the Martinez administration was so tightly bound with the oil and gas industry, and really so much supported by the oil and gas industry during the campaigns as well as during the administrations, that I think that's largely what drove her environmental policy, sort of the mining. Sorry, I have a cat in my kitchen who's making a ton of noise right now. Sorry. So I think the mining industry, the oil and gas industry, that was a big factor in the Martinez administration. And as far as like, I had this interesting conversation with Bradley Udall a few years ago, and kind of asked him what he thought about kind of the big climate deniers that you hear, like like Senator Inhofe, and kind of that level of person who denies climate change so vehemently and yet is so entwined in the inner workings of government and has access to information. And he kind of pointed out that these people know very well that the climate is changing and that it will have disastrous impacts on populations, on the environment, but they just, whether it's for personal profit or because they're confident that because of their wealth and their positions that their families will always be protected from these larger scale problems that other people have to deal with. I used to think it was just ignorance or, kind of science denial, but I think it's actually more insidious than that, unfortunately.
I think I agree with you. I did a little work on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge last year. And the deeper I looked into that, I mean, that's a place with probably not as much oil as people have bruited it for. And it's certainly fossil fuel that would take years to develop. And by the time it comes online, we won't need it, or it'll be too late for us anyhow. And I came away finally with the sense that a lot of the drive to develop that on the part of the Republicans comes out of just meanness
Yeah.
and spite, just to sock it to all those tree huggers who've been in our way for so long. And that there's kind of a theme of meanness and revenge in a lot of this that is extremely unconstructive.
Yeah, and I would love to ask you about this because, so I was looking back because I remember years ago you and Bill McKibben gave a talk, and I don't even remember where it was or what the event was, but I covered it for the Santa Fe Reporter. And so I went looking for that article today because I remember being really taken by that conversation. And so it was 2011, and you said during that talk, you and Bill both agreed that people needed to heal divisions and work together. And you said, the unbearable beauty of the land, the beauty of the planet need to continue to drive us. We need to do whatever we can to bring our polity back. And I thought, oh my gosh, that, like, 2011 seems like a magical dream compared to the way the country is now. And I'm curious, like, what you think, like, have we divided even further, and how do we come back, do you think?
Well, I think there's no question we are more divided than ever, and the chance of holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is gone. You know, meeting the Paris Accord bottom line goal of no more than 2 degrees of heating is, it's kind of an outside shot now. It's still technically possible, but it's really distant. We've squandered with Trump all these years, and we squandered 8 years under G.W. Bush. And I mean, we've known what to do, and we've had the technology to do it literally for decades, but we have not been able to muster the political will. And so we're all going to pay a huge price. But of course, poor people living, especially in marginalized environments, are going to pay the greatest price of all. And the rich will insulate themselves. The Senator Inhofes of the world will insulate themselves and write it off to some other set of causes. But I didn't mean to take us down the rabbit hole there. I do want to keep talking about your book. And I was interested that in many instances, you talked about the role of faith communities, interfaith power and light, the work of Larry Rasmussen and his book. I'm just wondering what caused you to emphasize that, and do you think that's a path that could bear some significant fruit for all of us?
Yeah. So I grew up Catholic, was raised Catholic, but I'm not religious. I'm not a person of faith, but I am really interested in, I'm interested in alliances, and I'm interested in who is talking about climate change that I wasn't expecting to be talking about climate change, I guess. And so I thought it was really interesting kind of what happened around leading up to the Paris Climate Accords, and like the Pope's encyclical, which I reread that again recently, and I was just so taken by that document. It's really extraordinary. And I guess I am always kind of thinking, who can I reach with this message who doesn't want to listen to someone like me, who doesn't want to listen to like a tree hugger lady? And so I just became more and more interested in the faith communities and and what their messages could be and where and the role that they play and the people who they can reach. And I have to admit, like I was so jazzed about the encyclical when it first came out, and I thought, oh, for sure. Um, you know, kind of with the heft of the Pope behind the message that, and I think that there are Catholic churches that, you know, do talk about climate change every once in a while, but I think I have been a little bit disappointed since then that more communities of faith and more churches and congregations haven't really emphasized climate change as much as I guess I had hoped would happen.
Well, speaking of communities more generally and of reaching people, one of the concerns I've been thinking about is that, you know, as our surface water supplies continue to decline, we know that's going to happen, or at least anybody who looks at the situation knows. And towns like Albuquerque and Santa Fe that are connected to big plumbing systems, the Rio Grande, the San Juan Chama diversion, the infrastructure of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District and so forth. Cities that have those plumbing connections are always going to have the opportunity, or mostly going to have the opportunity, of doing trades of ag water for cash and meeting their urban and industrial needs that way. But New Mexico has a lot of communities that aren't connected to big plumbing. Las Vegas is one, for instance, and there are small towns all over the state that are in that situation. And you've covered a lot of the state. I'm wondering what your sense is of people living out there from Claunch to Mountain Air, about their own sense of their water security.
Yeah, I think it's really scary to think about these little towns, and especially the ones who rely largely on groundwater. You know, we know there's a connection between surface water and groundwater in many places. So as it warms and our surface waters become less secure, some areas where the groundwater is connected to surface water, that's the case too. But I look back to, you know, when I first started reporting on climate change, a lot of people would kind of poo-poo what we were going through with drought and rising temperatures to say, New Mexico got through the 1950s. This, you know, this is nothing compared to the 1950s. Well, now we've seen drought conditions that were more severe than the 1950s, and we have the warming trend. But because of what we experienced in the 1950s, we started pumping that groundwater, relying on that groundwater, and we never stopped. We just kept taking more and more groundwater. So now, you know, you look at the southeastern part of the state and what's happening with the Ogallala, and you look even in, you know, places down around Estancia, Placitas, the East Mountains, Magdalena, these communities are, and Las Vegas, like you said, you know, their groundwater supplies are just tapped out. So unless you can afford to drill deeper and deeper wells to try to reach the water that's left, I mean, I think that's a really scary thing to think about. And I really wish that we talked about it a lot more. And you know, as you well know, water issues often and climate change issues often some people turn them into political or partisan discussions, and they just should not be.
Yeah. Well, I liked your passage in the book. You were talking about the difficulty of even getting a conversation with Susana Martinez, and then sort of catching her in the line to something and talking about forests, fuel buildup, and fire danger, And she sounds like Donald Trump talking about raking the forests. It
Yes.
was such a abysmal level of understanding at a time when New Mexico was burning all around. It's pretty spectacular how low leaders can go on these things.
Yeah, and just they have no sense. They're parroting some something they heard from somebody else or some talking points they were handed at some point. Yeah, her answer about how the feds needed to give the forests back to the states and that would stop the fires was just ridiculous.
It was truly absurd. Well, I see in a corner of my screen that we've got some questions building up. Um, let me run some of these by you, Laura. One attendee asked, do you think there will be climate refugees from New Mexico, people who will be forced to go elsewhere, and what will cause this?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that I've been more concerned about recently is climate refugees to New Mexico from places like California. Um, you know, as people in California or maybe who live along the coasts realize that they can, one, work from anywhere, and two, live someplace less risky than in a uh, you know, wild and urban interface like is all over California. Um, I think, you know, I kind of look at more people finding New Mexico more attractive and not putting potentially a strain on the resources that we have to share here, as well as, you know, a strain on real estate markets and things like that. So I think right now I'm a little more sort of watchful of what's going to happen to New Mexico, you know, because I feel like we have the water, we have water to meet needs as they stand right now for the most part. But if there is a large influx of people, I think that that becomes potentially more challenging.
Yeah, yeah.
What do
Here's
you
another.
think about that?
Well, I think people under stress are going to move. There are going to be people moving here. There are going to be people here who move elsewhere, and it's really hard to predict those things. The worst things get in Central America and in Mexico. That pressure on our southern border is not going to go away, no matter what kind of wall we build or what kind of public policy. We're going to see people in motion all around the world. And there's going to be an infinite need for compassion and for caring for the legions of uprooted people. And then there will also be so many people who have means and who will be in motion through election rather than through necessity. So my crystal ball is incredibly foggy on that question. Here's another question from the people watching. Is there a kind of activism that you have seen that is impactful in creating more focus on the climate?
So I have loved watching the youth movement develop. I feel like, unfortunately, COVID-19 and kind of the restrictions that that imposes has maybe not dampened youth activism, but had to change it. But I have really loved seeing that, particularly here in New Mexico, where you see youth groups working together, educating their teachers and fellow students and their families, and putting pressure on, say, the Albuquerque City Council, and really just raising the issue, and also pointing out the fact that we really messed up and the generations before us have messed up, and they're the ones who are going to have to bear the brunt of that. And I think drawing attention to the injustice of that is a really powerful thing. And so I find that really exciting. Like I mentioned earlier, I get really excited about alliances. And so I've also, in the wake of the Trump administration, you see, like, particularly along the US-Mexico border, you see activists who were working in, say, immigration rights and human rights and environmental issues and social justice issues, like, had been pretty siloed. And in the wake of the Trump administration, many of those groups have come together to work on issues together and be more powerful together. And I think that's, you know, electrifying.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I don't think my generation has done a very good job on this, so I'm hoping the next one will somehow get everybody in gear. We'll see. Another member of our audience asked, and I'm going to abbreviate this, but in terms of water conservation, what is the pressure on real estate developments? Is there a way to use water, the finite water supply, as a means to control real estate development through price increases, or through what?
Yeah, land and water development should certainly be linked. And I would imagine maybe in some cities or counties, it might be. I know here in Albuquerque and Bernalillo County, they are not. Land use and water use are not co-joined in terms of planning, but it seems ridiculous that in a state like New Mexico, public servants would allow a big development to start moving forward if there weren't guaranteed sustainable water supplies. And I know those conversations are probably happening more now than maybe they were 10 years ago, but it's definitely a policy that needs to catch up with reality in many places.
Yeah, I don't know of any place, though, that has successfully married water policy to development control. And if you allow the finite supply of water to drive up water prices, you run pretty quickly into the idea that access to adequate water should be a human right. And so it's really, it's a difficult thing. Santa Fe has a graduated water fee structure that attempts to address that, and perhaps does a fairly good job. But in terms of limiting real estate development, the development of residential housing and things like that, boy, it's a tough row. I remember back when I worked in conservation real estate, a land developer telling me, "Oh, come on, Bill. In New Mexico, you can always find the water you need." And I said, "Well, how do you do that?" And he says, "You just squeeze a hydrologist."
Not what I was expecting.
Yeah, well, the idea is that you can always get somebody to write a report that justifies what you want them to do.
Right.
Another question, do you think we can make the switch to renewables by 2045, which the writer thinks is the goal for Governor Lujan Grisham?
So weirdly enough, COVID has made me kind of strangely optimistic, or more optimistic than I was before, in terms of energy transition. I think that we know that coal is not economically feasible. Like, all environmental impacts and climate change impacts aside, we know that coal is not economically feasible. And we're seeing that the oil and gas industry, when you look at the long-term global forecasts for the oil and gas industry, analysts do not project a big boom in oil and gas again. So, New Mexico has long known that we need to diversify our economy so that we're not tied to the boom and bust of oil and gas and fossil fuel development in the state. And we've kind of always dragged our feet because it's a really hard transition to make. And frankly, the environment and the future of the planet was never a good enough excuse to really carry through that diversification. But now when we've seen, I feel like COVID, especially back in the spring, really gave us some really valuable insight into the vulnerability of oil and gas and relying on it as much as we do. And so I think we have this opportunity right now to say, oh yeah, let's hustle and diversify. And I think with that comes sort of the larger renewable energy transition. It's economically so much better for the state. All environmental issues aside, it's the right thing to do economically.
It's going to take an awful lot of political resolve to do it, however. So
yeah, and I like to imagine that people will be, legislators and others will be like, this isn't a tree hugger issue. This isn't this isn't people complaining about climate change. This is the right thing to do in terms of money. Maybe that will be a motivator.
yeah, true. Let's see about another. I think we've got one more question here, and I've got some more questions for you as well. Someone writes, wondering about our water laws, the use it or lose it mentality, the need to share with downstream users. Any hope for rethinking these in a more climate positive way? And to that, I would add also our compact obligations to Texas on the Pecos and on the Rio Grande. Oh my goodness, these are big bills that we're compelled to pay, and we don't really have the means to pay them in full.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, maybe it's just being home in my bubble too much the last 9 months. But again, like I feel a little bit of optimism about this, that we see how big the challenges are and there's no more putting them off, right? So I think there are some neat things happening in the state in terms of that use it or lose it mentality, where there are programs where you can fallow your fields and lease the water for environmental uses, or there are neat sorts of programs that are happening more than in the past. And so I think that helps that mentality, where somebody might not continue to flood irrigate a field where they don't actually grow anything that season, just because they're afraid that they might lose that water rights. The New Mexico Acequia Association is certainly a huge part of that conversation, and kind of finding different solutions in terms of kind of finding ways to prevent that mentality from continuing to take hold. The compacts are hugely problematic. As you know, whether it's on the Colorado River or the Rio Grande, they were negotiated at a time when the climate was different and politics were different. Who had a seat at the table was totally different from what you would hope would happen nowadays. But I think we really, when you look at, say, what Elephant Butte is at right now, and what our rivers are flowing at right now, and what the forecast is for this winter, like, we can't continue to just, eke away from one year to the next and hope that the next year will be better, because we know that it won't, right? And I always like to think of Daryl Vigil, who's from Hickory Apache, but works is the executive director for the 10 Tribes Partnership on the Colorado River. And I love, he goes into all these meetings all the time when they're talking about the Colorado River Compact, and he's always like, can't we just change the law? and everybody kind of freaks out like, no, no. But I think we need to be asking questions like that.
Well, both the Colorado River Compact and the Rio Grande Compact were based on assumptions about standard flow that have proved fallacious in terms of just normal business, but are extremely so in an era of warming climate. And before the show, you and I were talking a little bit about last winter, which was a pretty good snowfall in northern New Mexico. But what happened to the runoff?
Yeah, right.
It,
So
it
it
was
was
it was tiny.
terrible. Yeah, and so we had, from November to February, we had close to normal snowpack in the Rio Grande Basin. And then we had a warm, dry spring. And, by the end of May, the Rio Grande was starting to run dry. I think we had about 40 miles dry total this summer in 2 stretches. We had historically low flows through Albuquerque in October. The river bumped up recently. I suspect we were moving water to Elephant Butte, but it's back down low again. Even when we have close to normal snowpack, because of warming, we can't act like things are going to be what they were like 100 or even 50 years ago. We have to be planning for those drier conditions.
So if the fundamental conditions are changing, one might think that the laws and obligations enacted in a different age would come up for some revision.
Yeah.
If that happens.
Yeah, and I recognize there's like resistance to change, and there's fear that if you open something up, you can really mess it all up. But I think we really need to face those fears and those challenges. I have a quick question for you. Can I ask you a question?
Maybe.
So I feel like, especially since this book came out, but probably before that too, because I was writing about climate change so much, everybody wants to know where I find hope. And I don't really like that question. I understand why people ask it, and I certainly ask people. I'm like grasping at straws all the time, asking people where they find hope, because I guess I want somebody to reassure me that things are going to be okay, that we're not this like terrible species who really mess things up. But I really want to ask you, because I have loved your books, and I really loved The Last Unicorn about species extinction. But like, what do you think about that question of hope? Yeah.
Well, I used to get it a lot, and I would answer it with what I now regard as a bad answer. When people would ask, "Are you hopeful?" I'd say, "Well, I'm not sure that's the right question. Maybe the right question is not, are you hopeful, but what are you going to do?" But it is important to deal with hope. People can't live without hope. The trouble is, when people ask that question, the word means different things to different people. When it comes to climate change, if the meaning of hope in the questioner's intent is, are things going to turn out okay? Are they going to be like they were before we had this problem? Is everything going to get resolved? The answer is no. We will never again inhabit the earth that we grew up in. The Holocene epoch is truly ending. Maybe we should call the new epoch the Anthropocene or whatever, but we're entering a new time, and we have to think about hope in a different light. I like to think about hope the way Václav Havel defined it. He said, hope is not an expectation that things will turn out all right. It's a commitment to doing the right thing because you know that it's right. And that's what he did all his time in Czechoslovakia under the Soviets. He never knew whether the Soviet Union was going to fall in his lifetime, but he knew that he needed to do the right thing just in case it did, and that he needed to be ready. And that's sort of like the meaning of hope that Barbara Kingsolver gives in an interview that I've quoted in something I've written. She says, the hope is not optimism. The optimistic person says, oh, don't worry about the winter, everything will be fine. And the pessimistic person says, well, no, the winter's going to be awful, we're all going to die. But the hopeful person says, you know, things could turn out better than we think, and so I'm going to put some potatoes in the root cellar just in case we're alive in February and need to eat them. So Barbara's vision of hope is a lot like the ecological concept of surprise. We have to learn to become comfortable in not knowing and in doing the right thing, as Václav Havel says, in the meantime. And not knowing how things will turn out, but being ready to make the most of any good opportunity, any surprise in the ecosystem that pops up. So that's the kind of hope that I think we really need to cultivate. And I think that's the kind of hope that Mandela had all those 33 years on Robben Island. You know, he never gave up that kind of hope. And when apartheid crumpled the way the Soviet Union did, and suddenly opportunity was there, he was ready for it because he had, all along, he'd been doing the right thing and maintaining his preparation. That was a living kind of hope.
I love that.
So I'll add one more thing that you mentioned Bill McKibben a little while ago. I remember hearing Bill talk in Las Cruces at NMSU, and after, it was a great talk, of course, and after the talk, a whole bunch of people came up to ask him questions. And I was standing on the edge of that group and listened to a woman ask him, okay, well, you've convinced me that climate change is happening. What's the best way to prepare for it and to defend against the problems that it will bring up? And Bill answered, the best thing to do is to live in a strong community. Yes. And the woman asked the obvious follow-up question. She asked, well, how do you find a strong community? And Bill answered brilliantly, I thought. He said, you don't, you build it. And I think that's really the bottom line for all of us as we deal with this problem and all our other problems, frankly.
I agree. And I think, you know, New Mexico, we know that we have an entire suite of problems that we need to address, from like a crumbled behavioral or a destroyed behavioral health system to, you know, addressing our private prisons. I mean, we know we have so many challenges, and climate change is related in some ways to all of those things. And I think it can feel overwhelming sometimes, but I love New Mexico because I love our communities, and I love that we all know one another. And even when we disagree, there are some fringe folks out there these days, but even when we disagree, we can communicate and care about one another. And there is no place in the world I would rather be to weather a disaster, whether that's COVID or climate change. New Mexico is extraordinary for its communities.
I agree with you completely. New Mexicans also have the knack of getting by on little.
Yes.
So that's a great training to have. Well, listen, we're pretty far along in time, and I just have one wrap-up question for you, Laura. And it's a question I always think about for myself and love to ask other writers, and that is, did writing this book change you? And what does the change feel like? And what does that bode for the next big project?
Yeah, I think that this book changed me by making me a little bit more gentle. I think as a reporter, and particularly as a reporter who worked during the Bush administration and then the Martinez administration, it's easy to become hard and defensive and angry and to always be expecting the worst of people. And I think working on this book, the luxury of a print um, book that you know somebody is going to hold in their hands and sit on their couch or their back porch or read it in bed or whatever, it forced me to be a little bit more gentle with readers because I wanted them to come along with me, and I didn't want to make them angry. I wanted them to feel compassion and love and community as well. So I think this project made me quite a bit nicer and more gentle through the end of it.
Oh, that's a beautiful sentiment. I must say, I never exactly figured you for an unnice person previously, but if you're even nicer now, then you'll be setting records. Let me sum up by, first of all, thanking the Santa Fe Conservation Trust for hosting this event, and also by exhorting the people out there who've been with us to buy this book. Laura wrote this book so you would read it. And so please go down to Collected Works, always our favorite bookstore, which has a long history with the Santa Fe Conservation Trust, and order the book from Collected Works or get it wherever you need to, but I hope you consider Collected Works first and get this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you both. I love that we ended it with strong communities, gentleness, and doing what you feel you need to do and doing what you feel is right. Those were really powerful messages to end this discussion about climate change with. I, on behalf of the Santa Fe Conservation Trust, want to thank you both, Bill and Laura, for joining us, taking time tonight, sharing your personal thoughts, sharing the book, which is wonderful. Please go to Collected Works and get this book. Collected Works also has a collection of Bill's books. So please share in the love from these two authors. We wish everybody a safe, happy, healthy holiday. Thanks so much for joining us. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but that just shows everybody's interest and heartfelt compassion for this issue and for our state. So thank you so much to both of you, and hopefully we will be hearing more from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Laura. And thank you, Joanne. Bye-bye.
Bye.